Welcome to Clandestine Cases. The village of Chipping Barton rarely witnessed anything more disruptive than a thunderstorm or a wayward sheep blocking the high street. But the morning after Colonel Denham's birthday luncheon, the village awoke to something darker. The colonel, a former cavalryman with an iron sense of pride and a habit of raising his voice at anything that mildly inconvenienced him, had turned 73 the previous afternoon. His housekeeper, Mrs. Tilling, had arranged a modest celebration at the manor, with a handful of close acquaintances, his niece Clara Denham, the vicar and his wife, the village doctor, and of course Miss Marple, who had taken the late invitation out of courtesy. It was a cheerful gathering, with the table set in the conservatory and a splendid cake brought out at the end, chocolate sponge with raspberry filling, made by the new baker's assistant, a nervous young man named Lewis, who'd recently moved from London. At precisely 4:17 p.m., Colonel Denham sliced the first piece himself, served a wedge to each guest, and raised his glass in a final toast. Everyone joined in. The conversation resumed, the tea poured, and the cake quickly vanished. By 5:15, Clara had excused herself to drive to the train station. The vicar and his wife left soon after, and the doctor stayed behind to examine the colonel's gout. Miss Marple returned to her cottage around 6, remarking later that the weather had taken a rather unpleasant turn by evening. The colonel was dead before 7. The cause was unmistakable: poison. Dr. Penrose, who had returned home shortly after his post-luncheon examination, was summoned again just after 6:30 by Mrs. Tilling, who'd found the colonel collapsed beside his favourite armchair in the drawing-room. He was clutching his stomach, and a half-empty glass of brandy lay beside him on the floor. His lips were discoloured. The preliminary opinion was strychnine, poisoning so severe and so sudden that no one had time to call for help. The question, naturally, was how. The colonel had eaten only what everyone else had: sandwiches, scones, and the infamous cake. The brandy was from his personal cabinet, which had not been touched during the party, and which, according to Mrs. Tilling, he opened only after the guests had gone. The teacups had been cleared by Mrs. Tilling herself and washed thoroughly. No one else had fallen ill. There was nothing unusual in the food, and nothing obviously wrong with the glassware or cutlery. The bottle of brandy, when tested later, showed no signs of tampering. The police, led by Inspector Drew from the county station, interviewed each guest the following day. No one had seen anything strange. Clara was visibly distressed, saying her uncle had seemed perfectly well when she left. The vicar's wife, who had a reputation for noting everyone's behaviour, could only recall that Lewis, the assistant baker, had trembled as he cut the cake. Mrs. Tilling vouched for him. He'd only been delivering the order and returned straight away. The cake itself had tasted heavenly, she claimed. Miss Marple, who had taken only a small slice, found herself replaying the details of the day with growing discomfort. Something had struck her as off, but she could not yet place it. What truly puzzled Inspector Drew was the fact that the cake, what remained of it, was tested and found clean. No traces of poison. Neither were there traces in the tea, the brandy, or the sandwiches. No fingerprints had been found on the brandy glass other than the colonel's own. The poisoning, swift and brutal, had left behind no clear method, no clear moment, and no suspect. The police began speculating. Perhaps the poison had been slipped into the colonel's mouth afterward, perhaps in his pipe tobacco, or even in his medication, though Dr. Penrose said he took none. But even those ideas went nowhere. 3 days later, the village turned to Miss Marple. Not officially, of course, but subtly, through careful remarks in the churchyard, polite queries in the grocer's queue, and unsolicited cups of tea at her cottage. Even Inspector Drew, initially skeptical of the elderly spinster's involvement, admitted that it might be useful if she were to cast an eye over the circumstances. And cast an eye she did, on the cake, the cutlery, the sequence of events, and especially the young assistant baker Lewis, whose nervousness lingered with her more than she cared to admit. The Colonel's will was read the following afternoon. As expected, Clara inherited the house, the garden, and a considerable sum. But there was an odd clause, a sealed envelope, left in the Colonel's desk drawer to be opened only in the event of his death by unnatural means. The solicitor handed it to Inspector Drew, who opened it in the presence of all parties. Inside was a single sheet handwritten by the Colonel himself. Should I perish in any unexpected fashion, I name the person most likely responsible as someone who stands to gain what they do not yet deserve. Look not at who baked the cake, but at who chose to serve it. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward in her chair as the words were read aloud. The inspector frowned. Everyone had served themselves. Or had they? Mrs. Tilling had taken her piece first, followed by the vicar's wife, then Miss Marple, then Clara. The Colonel had served himself and insisted on slicing every other portion thereafter. Lewis had brought the cake, sliced only the first piece, and left. If poison had been present, it would have been in the first few servings, yet no one else had fallen ill. Which meant, if the cake was not poisoned and the brandy untouched, something else had been the vector. Something timed, something precise, something subtle. The doctor's note confirmed death from strychnine poisoning, absorbed internally. But where? And when? And how? The answer remained buried in a detail, something out of place but not yet visible. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, recalling the scene at the table, the smell of the raspberries, the lace doilies under the tea, plates, the awkward smile Lewis had given Clara as he left. There was something in that moment, something she would need to revisit before the truth could rise to the surface. The crime, so simple and yet so elusive, had begun with a birthday cake. But where it would end was still hidden behind layers of silence, fear, and calculation. Miss Marple returned to Denham Manor the next morning under the polite pretext of visiting Clara, who had remained in the house out of a mixture of mourning and necessity. The air in the drawing-room was still heavy, not with grief, but with the sterile emptiness left by disruption. Clara looked worn and uncertain, her movements stilted, as though she were afraid of leaving fingerprints on the furniture. Mrs. Tilling offered tea and departed quickly, murmuring something about polishing the silver. Clara seemed glad of company but was not ready to talk. Miss Marple sat quietly, glancing around the room, not with suspicion, but with the quiet diligence of someone who knew that people rarely noticed what they weren't looking for. On the small table near the armchair where Colonel Denham had died, a single silver napkin ring sat by itself. It seemed harmless, polished like everything else in the house, but Miss Marple found it strange. Why just one? The rest of the tea service had already been cleared. Perhaps it had been overlooked, or perhaps it hadn't. She filed the observation away in her mind, careful not to let the conversation drift there just yet. Clara, she noticed, seemed particularly preoccupied with the envelope her uncle had left behind. She brought it up twice without prompting, each time asking what Miss Marple thought he'd meant. Who chose to serve it? Clara repeated with furrowed brows. He sliced it himself. What more is there? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Your uncle liked control. Slicing his own birthday cake may have seemed like a simple thing, but I imagine to him it was quite symbolic. He didn't want to be surprised. Clara gave a dry chuckle which faded quickly. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did he eat anything before the luncheon? Anything special, perhaps? Something someone brought him? Clara shook her head. No one brought anything, and he wouldn't have eaten it if they had. He was very particular about food. Even the cake he only agreed to because it came from that new place and not the Women's Institute. He didn't trust village baking competitions. Miss Marple nodded slowly. then asked if she might step into the conservatory again, where the luncheon had taken place. Clara agreed, and Miss Marple wandered through the wide doorway, gazing at the spotless floor, the empty cake stand, and the clean silver cutlery in a neat rack on the sideboard. One cake knife remained out, longer than the others and set aside as though recently polished. A faint trail of dried raspberry filling had settled near the base, barely visible, but still there. She looked at the stain, then at the cake stand, beside it, and then at the floral tablecloth beneath the place where the Colonel had sat. There was no other stain nearby. A thought began to form. Half an idea, not yet ready. Miss Marple didn't believe in coincidences, not in domestic matters. When things were misplaced or singular items left behind, it was usually someone's mind forgetting or deliberately obscuring. She returned to the drawing room, thanked Clara, and made her way into the village on foot, quietly reflecting on everything that had been said and left unsaid. She stopped by the bakery under the pretense of ordering a fruit loaf, and young Louis emerged from the back, flour-dusted and tense. He blinked too often, he gave exact answers. When she asked if the raspberry filling had been homemade, he replied, "It comes in a sealed tub. We don't make that bit here." That was the only time his voice broke. He looked away, wiping his hands on his apron, and retreated to the kitchen before she could follow up. It was enough. Not a confession, of course, but a crack in the carefully arranged surface of the case. She left without her loaf and walked toward the church, where she knew she'd find the vicar tending to the grounds. He greeted her with the warmth of someone relieved to speak of anything other than death. But Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the luncheon. "You were seated beside Clara, weren't you?" she asked gently. The vicar nodded. "And who was nearest the cake?" He frowned. The Colonel, naturally. He kept it right in front of him until everyone had a piece. "And Clara? She helped pass plates, I believe. That's normal, isn't it?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes, quite normal, especially when someone wants to seem useful." She walked back slowly, considering the dynamic. Clara had said she did nothing unusual, yet multiple people had recalled her assisting with the cake. If the cake itself had no poison and the brandy bottle was untouched, then perhaps it wasn't the food or drink at all. Perhaps the delivery had been more intimate, more deliberate, something passed directly to the Colonel's lips, something that might leave no trace, a moment of distraction, a wipe of a mouth, a dab with a napkin soaked in something lethal. And that lonely napkin ring, why just one? She returned to Denham Manor later that evening, asking Mrs. Tilling if she might borrow the linen napkins used during the party. Mrs. Tilling, though puzzled, retrieved them from the laundry basket, assuring Miss Marple they had not yet been washed. There were 6, each folded and neatly pressed, though one had a peculiar stiffness to it as though it had dried differently. She didn't need a laboratory to know what she suspected. Inspector Drew was less than thrilled to receive her call, but curiosity drove him to listen. Miss Marple presented the stiffened napkin, the lonesome ring, and the observation about Clara's proximity to her uncle during the meal. Drew asked whether she was accusing Clara outright, but Miss Marple only smiled. No, not yet. But someone served him something that was not cake, something directly placed in his hand or to his mouth, something no one else touched, perhaps even a napkin. The inspector looked unconvinced. Why would Clara do such a thing? Miss Marple's eyes were calm. People kill for money, but they also kill to prevent secrets from coming out. And the Colonel was not a man who kept unpleasant truths to himself indefinitely. We must look not only at who gained, but who feared what the Colonel might have said. That night, Clara burned a small pile of letters in the fireplace of her late uncle's study. She watched them curl into ash, unaware that one of them had been seen earlier by the housekeeper. An envelope addressed to someone named Margaret, with a date from 15 years ago. Mrs. Tilling, unsure whether it mattered, would mention it to Miss Marple the next morning. And that single name, Margaret, would be the key that unlocked everything. The next morning, the sky over Chipping Barton hung low with grey mist, and a steady drizzle tapped gently against the window panes of Denham Manor as Inspector Drew returned, this time with firmer resolve and Miss Marple beside him. Clara met them in the hall with her usual guarded politeness, her posture sharp, voice steady, but her eyes carried the dull sheen of someone worn thin by scrutiny. The inspector explained. He needed to clarify a few points, and Clara nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, as if it would help her think more clearly. They settled into the study, the fire still smouldering in the hearth from the night before, a faint scent of char lingering in the air. "Clara," Drew began, glancing briefly at Miss Marple, "when did you last see the letters your uncle kept in this desk?" Clara blinked, caught slightly off guard. "Letters? Oh, you mean the ones from his war days? I don't know. I wasn't in the habit of going through his personal things." "Of course," Drew said lightly, "but Mrs. Tilling mentioned seeing you holding one yesterday afternoon. Something addressed to Margaret. You were near the fire shortly after." Clara's smile faltered just enough to be noticed. "Oh, yes, I found a few envelopes while sorting things. I didn't recognize the name. They didn't seem relevant." "Still," Miss Marple said softly, "perhaps relevant to him. Margaret is not an uncommon name, but it might explain why he added that curious clause in his will, to suggest someone feared what he might reveal." She studied Clara closely. "Did your uncle ever speak of a woman named Margaret?" Clara hesitated, then answered too quickly. "No, never. He wasn't the sort to dwell on sentiment." The inspector nodded slowly but made no immediate comment. Instead, he requested Mrs. Tilling join them. The housekeeper arrived with hands folded and an expression more nervous than usual. When asked about the envelope, she glanced uneasily at Clara before speaking. "It was about 4, maybe past," she said. "Miss Denham had gone into the study alone. When I brought in the tray, I saw her with a bundle of papers. There was one on top, cream envelope, the name written in red ink. Margaret, plain as anything. She didn't look pleased to see me." "I wasn't hiding anything," Clara said quickly. "I was trying to decide what to keep. It was personal." "That may be true," Miss Marple said gently, "but it's strange timing, don't you think? Burning letters the night of your uncle's death, and particularly one addressed to a woman no one seems to know." Clara's composure strained. "You're trying to twist ordinary things into something sinister." "I was overwhelmed. The fire was for comfort, not destruction." Inspector Drew let the silence stretch, then stood and turned to Miss Marple. "Let's speak to the others, shall we?" They started with Dr. Penrose, who arrived promptly when summoned. The doctor was a precise man, meticulous in dress and speech, and visibly wary of the growing attention on the case. When asked again about the time he left the manor, he replied, 5:15. Clara walked me out. But Mrs. Tilling said, "You stayed later," Drew noted. Penrose's brow furrowed. "She's mistaken. I had a patient to visit at 5:30 in Lower Barton. Ask the Lambtons." "We have," said Drew. "They said you arrived closer to 6. A beat passed. The doctor adjusted his cuffs. "I may have misremembered. It was an emotional afternoon." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did the Colonel confide in you, Doctor? About anything troubling?" Penrose paused, then offered a diplomatic answer. "He was proud and stubborn, but sharp-minded. I believe he feared something, perhaps blackmail, but he was too proud to name it outright." The word hovered. Clara had tensed at the sound of it. Blackmail. That would explain the strange clause in the will, the sealed envelope, and the reference to someone who stood to gain prematurely. If the Colonel suspected someone close to him of betrayal, perhaps he set the trap himself. Next came Lewis, the assistant baker. He arrived at the manor damp from the rain, pale as ever, and clearly uncomfortable. He sat hunched, fingers gripping his cap. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said immediately, voice trembling. "I just delivered the cake." "We're not accusing you," Miss Marple said kindly. "Just trying to understand the order of things. When you delivered the cake, did anyone else speak with you privately?" Lewis glanced up, then away. "Miss Denham came into the kitchen while I was setting it on the tray. Said she wanted to check the decorations." His throat bobbed. "She touched it." "Touched it how?" Drew asked. He hesitated, took off a sugar flower, said it was crooked. Then she asked for the cake knife and passed it back. "I didn't think anything of it." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Drew. That knife, the one with the raspberry stain, had been used after all. And Clara had handled it before the party began. If the knife carried residue, it might have been the vector, not the cake. The act of cutting itself. Before they dismissed Lewis, Miss Marple asked one last thing. "Did the Colonel speak to you? Anything memorable?" Lewis shook his head. "He just said, 'You're not local.' I said, 'No, ma'am,' that was it." Their final interview of the day was with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Elspeth Terrell, who had a habit of talking in circles but remembered everything. She sat in the same conservatory chair she'd used during the luncheon and described the meal, down to the placement of the spoons. "The Colonel seemed cheerful," she said, "a bit brusque, but that was him. He had a fondness for Clara, though he teased her terribly. Said she always made messes of things when she tried too hard." "What kind of messes?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, she once broke a vase arranging flowers for the bishop's visit, and she hid the pieces in the garden to avoid scolding. He brought it up every Christmas. Said she panicked when cornered." Miss Marple nodded. "A woman who feared confrontation, who burned letters, who overcompensated with poise, and who had reason, perhaps, to keep certain things buried." As the day ended and the rain slowed, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, a thin thread of truth beginning to form between the conflicting accounts. Penrose had lied about his timing. Clara had altered the cake before it reached the table. Lewis had been the unwitting courier. And the napkin had not been used. It had been placed intentionally. What remained was motive, not just money, but fear. And if Margaret, whoever she was, posed a threat to someone's inheritance or respectability, it would explain a desperate act committed under the guise of family celebration. Miss Marple poured herself a modest cup of tea and sat by the window. The mist still clung to the hedgerows. Somewhere in the silence, she felt the edges of the story settling into place. The lies had started to show their seams. All that remained was to pull the right thread and watch the fabric come undone. The next morning arrived with a chill that seemed to seep through the bricks of Miss Marple's cottage, as though even the weather was waiting for something to break. She stepped into her garden with her coat buttoned and her mind already turning. There were too many threads, and none of them led neatly to a single knot. Clara, Lewis, Dr. Penrose, they all had moments that didn't line up. But none of them, not even Clara with her fire and her envelope, felt like the sole architect of the Colonel's death. Miss Marple believed in people doing foolish things under pressure, but she also believed in cause and effect. And something about this case was still resisting alignment. At Inspector Drew's request, she returned to the manor shortly after 10 to assist in reviewing what they now called the Circle, the guests and staff present on the day of the luncheon, along with anyone whose actions may have indirectly touched the timeline of the death. They gathered in the Colonel's study, where Drew had pinned notes and times to a small corkboard and scrawled connections in thick pencil. But while he looked for who had done what when, Miss Marple turned her attention to the why. Clara, the most obvious suspect, had both motive and opportunity. The inheritance was substantial. Property, liquid assets, even a modest portfolio of railway stocks. But that alone wouldn't have been enough for murder. Clara had always depended on the Colonel, tolerated his strictness, and despite the uncomfortable family dynamic, She didn't strike Miss Marple as the greedy type. Unless something had shifted. Unless she had discovered her future was not as secure as she'd assumed. Perhaps the Colonel had threatened to change his will. Perhaps the arrival of a letter from someone like Margaret, a name from the past, posed a danger to Clara's position. If Margaret was a former lover, a long-lost daughter, or even a first wife, her appearance could easily alter the inheritance, especially if the Colonel had intended to make amends. Then there was Dr. Penrose. His alibi had already shown cracks, and his manner had grown increasingly rehearsed. He hadn't seemed surprised by the poison diagnosis, and his insistence that the Colonel had taken no medication was unusual for a man of that age. Miss Marple remembered something else as well. The Colonel's long-standing appointment with the doctor every other Thursday. Not for gout, but for monitoring. Could Penrose have known about a terminal illness, something the Colonel hadn't shared with anyone else? If so, and if that illness tied somehow to the identity of this Margaret, say if she were a child, conceived during the war, and Penrose had helped cover it up, it could make sense that he feared the past returning. Miss Marple asked for the Colonel's calendar. It was sparse, but one entry stood out. 2 weeks prior, the words "Marg letter sent" had been written in blue ink. No surname, no address, but it suggested the Colonel had reached out to someone, not received anything. That changed everything. It meant the Colonel wasn't being blackmailed. He was reaching out, trying to reconnect, perhaps even make amends. And if he had revealed that to Clara or Penrose, either could have felt their future unraveling. She thought again of Lewis, the baker's assistant. Young, nervous, too helpful. His only confirmed contact was with the cake, but he'd also been seen in the manor kitchen before the luncheon, and he'd known who Clara was. That hadn't sat right. Why would a stranger working part-time in a bakery have a familiarity with someone like Clara, unless there was more to the story? Miss Marple requested to speak with Lewis again, this time away from the manor. He met her, in the back of the bakery, where the heat of the ovens did nothing to ease his nerves. She spoke softly, almost like a grandmother asking about the weather. "You mentioned you weren't from the village," she said. "Where did you live before?" "Eastbourne," he replied too quickly. Before that, he hesitated. "Kent. But I don't remember much. Moved around a lot." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "And how did you come to work at the bakery?" "I saw the notice. I needed work. But you didn't mention your surname." "I think it's Margaret's surname too, isn't it? Denham." Lewis stiffened. His hands twitched at his sides. "I don't know what you mean." But Miss Marple could already see the shape of the truth. The Colonel hadn't been killed because someone feared blackmail. He had reached out to his past, invited it into his present, and someone else had panicked. She looked at Lewis with fresh understanding. He wasn't the killer. He was the trigger. "You're his grandson, aren't you?" His mouth opened, but he said nothing. "The Colonel wrote to Margaret. She must have told you. Or perhaps you found the letter yourself. You came here to see him. Not as a guest, of course, that would have raised questions. But as a bakery boy. Slipping into the edges of the party, did you speak to him?" Lewis swallowed. "He recognized me. I think he knew the moment I walked in. But he didn't say anything." Miss Marple didn't press him further. The sadness in his eyes was enough. The boy had come hoping for a connection, and someone else had seen that as a threat. Clara, perhaps. Or Penrose, if he'd helped bury the truth long ago. Back at the manor, Miss Marple sat with Drew and laid out the tangled maze. Clara feared losing everything, not just money, but identity. The truth of Lewis's connection would reduce her inheritance, if not erase it. She had the motive, and she had manipulated the setting. Removing the sugar flour, handling the knife. Dr. Penrose had motive too, fear of disgrace, maybe guilt, but he lacked the access Clara had that day. "There's still one thing I don't understand," Drew said. "Why the napkin?" Miss Marple tapped her finger lightly. "It's not that it was used to deliver the poison. It's that it wasn't used at all. It was staged. Clara placed it there to make us think he'd wiped his mouth, perhaps ingested something from it. But the poison wasn't in the napkin, it was on the knife. But the knife was shared. She knew that. Which is why she passed him his slice first, cut with the stained side. She wiped the blade between servings, made it look like she was being tidy. A clever woman panicking in the only way she knew how. The motive wasn't just greed. It was fear of a shifting identity, of a buried truth rising too close to the surface. Clara had built a life around being the Colonel's heir, his legacy. And Lewis's arrival threatened to rewrite that narrative. The pieces were aligning. But it was not quite time to act. Miss Marple had one more step, one final test, to make sure her theory held. She needed to speak with Clara again, alone, and in the room where the murder had begun. Because sometimes the motive hid not in what was done, but in what people couldn't bear to lose. The drawing room at Denham Manor had been tidied into sterile neatness, as though the space could distance itself from the violence it had quietly witnessed. Miss Marple arrived just after luncheon at Inspector Drew's invitation, though she suspected his tone had been less about consultation this time, and more about confirmation. He met her in the study, a file in his hand and a look of cautious triumph. "It's Penrose," he said without waiting for her to sit. "We searched his surgery this morning. Found a vial of strychnine in the locked cabinet. No record of prescription, no reason for it to be there. I confronted him. He didn't deny it." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows only slightly. "And what was his explanation?" "That it was a sample left by a pharmaceutical rep. Claimed he forgot it was there." She offered no comment. "Also," Drew continued, "we found a letter. A draft, unsigned. He'd written to someone, possibly Margaret, we think, asking her not to come forward. 'It will destroy everything,' he wrote. 'You don't know what you're risking.' If the Colonel had invited her here, it explains why Penrose might act, to keep her silent." "A compelling theory," Miss Marple said softly, her voice even, "but too linear." Drew frowned. "You think it's wrong?" "I think," she replied, "it's tidy. Too tidy. It answers the surface of the problem, but not the underside." He leaned forward. He had access. He stayed longer than he claimed. He had a motive. And yet the Colonel was not a man who trusted many. Penrose was one of the few he did. If he feared the past, why would he consult the doctor and invite a stranger back into his life at the same time? No, something else still lingers. Penrose might have lied, but I'm not convinced he killed. Drew's jaw tightened. He had the poison. Many doctors do. Before he could respond, a knock interrupted them. It was Clara, standing stiffly in the doorway, hands folded in front of her. "I heard," she said without waiting to be invited in. "Dr. Penrose, it's awful." Miss Marple turned to her. "You look relieved." Clara blinked. "What?" "No, just surprised, but not shocked." Clara hesitated. "He always seemed controlled, but now that you mention it, he was nervous that day. I thought it was just the Colonel. They had a difficult relationship." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, then said gently, "Would you walk with me? Just the two of us?" Clara hesitated, then nodded, and they stepped into the cold garden path outside, the clipped hedges stark against the winter grass. They passed the rose beds, long since trimmed back, and circled toward the side lawn. For a while, neither spoke. "Clara," Miss Marple said at last, "I don't believe you poisoned your uncle. Not yet, but I do believe you've lied." Clara's voice cracked as she tried to mask it with composure. "I don't know what you mean. You knew who Lewis was. You knew why he came." Clara's jaw tightened. "Even if I did, what Does that prove? It proves fear. You feared your place would change, that the colonel might name someone else. But fear alone isn't guilt. I didn't kill him. No, Miss Marple said, her voice almost kind. But you watched him die, didn't you? Clara's mouth parted, but she didn't speak. You saw him take the cake, drink the brandy. You saw the first signs, the cramp, the discomfort. And you waited. Perhaps you thought he was pretending, or overreacting. Or perhaps you hoped it was just his heart giving out on its own. Clara's eyes welled. He was cruel. You think I don't feel anything, but I do. He told me that morning, told me he was changing the will, that he'd found his grandson, that Lewis was going to take everything, and I... You panicked, Miss Marple finished. I didn't poison him. I swear it. Miss Marple nodded. Then you must help us find who did. Back at the bakery, Inspector Drew was preparing to officially charge Dr. Penrose, though Lewis was absent, having left for the day early. Sick, said the owner. Didn't look well. Miss Marple asked if Lewis had received any mail recently, and the owner hesitated before retrieving a folded envelope from the back. Came yesterday. Didn't pick it up? The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was precise, clean. Inside was a short note. Don't trust what they tell you. He didn't want you here. He was going to disown you again. It was unsigned. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it slowly. It didn't sound like Penrose, it didn't sound like Clara. It sounded like someone who needed Lewis to leave. Someone who wanted the case closed. Miss Marple returned to the manor and asked to see the colonel's records, his banking files, his appointment book, anything left intact. Clara retrieved them hesitantly, but they revealed something new, a wire transfer made the week before the luncheon, a large sum, the recipient, an account under a trust name traced by Drew's team to a third party unrelated to the family, and suddenly, everything bent. It wasn't Clara, it wasn't Penrose, it wasn't even fear of a changed will. It was something else. Someone else. Someone who had orchestrated the conditions, planted enough suspicion on those nearby, and now watched from the shadows as the blame landed elsewhere. Miss Marple didn't yet know who, but she knew they were still close, watching, waiting. She looked once more at the note addressed to Lewis, now folded on her lap. False comfort in a tidy answer. Penrose would take the fall. Clara would retreat in silence. And the real killer, calm, calculating, had just bought themselves a quiet escape. But not for long. The fire in Miss Marple's cottage burned low as evening drew in, its soft warmth doing little to quiet the unease that had taken root in her thoughts. The case was shifting in shape. What had appeared to be a domestic quarrel, wrapped in inheritance, now hinted at something deeper. Penrose's arrest had satisfied the authorities, and Clara had retreated into silence. But Miss Marple had never put her faith in neat conclusions. The anonymous letter to Lewis gnawed at her. Someone had manipulated the boy, drawn him in only to push him out again. And someone had orchestrated just enough noise to let others take the fall. That kind of thinking didn't come from panic, it came from practice. She sat down once more with the colonel's notebook, scanning for anything that had been missed. Most of it was what one might expect: garden reminders, pension deposits, notes about local meetings. But one entry near the back caught her eye. Meeting confirmed, C. Eldridge, 2:30 at the Hare. The ink was darker, newer than most of the others. The date matched the Monday before the luncheon. She stared at the name. It didn't ring any village bells. She knew every Eldridge in the parish register, and there were none. Curious, she visited the Hare and Thistle the next morning, a quiet inn on the outskirts of the village where the colonel occasionally held his veterans' meetings. The landlord, a stout man named Mr. Wills, had been there for years, and remembered everyone by habit. When asked about a Mr. Eldridge, he paused, then nodded. "Yes, now you say it, I do remember. Tall fellow, dark suit, came in quiet, sat with Denham in the corner booth. They talked for a good while. Didn't seem friendly, if you ask me. Did you hear what they discussed?" Mr. Will shook his head. "They kept their voices low. But I saw Denham slam his hand on the table once. Not like him to make a scene." Miss Marple thanked him and left, the name repeating in her mind. Eldridge, not from the village, not listed in the Colonel's estate. And yet the meeting had clearly agitated him. She walked directly to the county records office, bypassing the constabulary entirely, and requested to see any public files relating to the name Eldridge, military, legal, financial. It took over an hour, but one document emerged, a court record from nearly 2 decades ago. A man named Charles Eldridge, discharged dishonorably from the army following an embezzlement scandal. The victim of the scheme, Colonel Denham, then Major Denham, who had reported Eldridge for siphoning funds from the regiment's supply accounts during their deployment in Cyprus. Eldridge had served 5 years, then disappeared. The past had come back, not in the form of a long-lost son or secret lover, but of betrayal. If the colonel had arranged a meeting with Eldridge, it was not for reconciliation. He had likely discovered the man's whereabouts and summoned him to confront him once more, perhaps to threaten legal action or public exposure. But that didn't explain the link to the current crime. Not yet. She returned to the village and asked to see the letter. Lewis had received again. The handwriting was careful but not impersonal. She compared it with the colonel's own, not a match. But something about the curves of the G and the flick of the R in Margaret reminded her of someone else's hand. A sample from one of the parish Christmas cards sat in her drawer, signed by the solicitor who had read the colonel's will, Mr. Alan Bryce. She pulled it out, held the envelope beside it, and frowned. The similarity was striking. That evening she arranged for a quiet conversation with Mr. Bryce, under the guise of needing legal advice. They met in his office on the High Street, where he sat comfortably behind his desk, confident in the casual authority that came with years of handling village affairs. Miss Marple kept her questions light, conversational, until she mentioned the name, Eldridge. His reaction was immediate and imperceptibly cautious. "Old name. Don't think I've heard it recently. But it's in your files, isn't it?" She asked sweetly. "You were involved in the original court proceedings, were you not? The military tribunal requested a local legal observer. I imagine you didn't expect the name to come back after all these years." Bryce's smile faded slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm implying that someone with a long-standing grudge might have seen an opportunity. That perhaps, when the colonel made contact with Eldridge, someone close to both of them realized the danger, not just to the colonel, but to themselves." He leaned back, expression tight. "That was a long time ago. Water under the bridge. Not if that bridge was set alight." She paused, then added gently, "Bryce, did Eldridge know something about you?" His silence was the only answer she needed. Later that night, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and laid out what she now believed. Bryce had served alongside the colonel, albeit in an administrative capacity. He'd kept quiet during the embezzlement trial, but perhaps he had benefited from it. Perhaps some of the siphoned funds had found their way into accounts he controlled, or perhaps Eldridge had taken the fall for both of them. Whatever the truth, it had resurfaced. Denham's meeting with Eldridge had likely ended in threats, legal, financial, or reputational. Bryce, acting to preserve himself, had intervened, not by poisoning the cake. That would be too obvious, too risky. But he had access to the colonel's affairs. He managed the estate, the records, the legal filings. He knew about Lewis's arrival, about the will being updated, about the trust fund transfer. It was he who planted the idea that Penrose had sent the letter to Margaret. He who could nudge Clara toward panic could nudge the police toward Penrose. And the real killer, not a jealous niece or a panicked doctor, a solicitor, practiced in paperwork, patient and precise, who had borrowed from the shadows of the past to strike in the present. Miss Marple folded her hands slowly. The web was nearly complete. But she would need one final thread, something undeniable, to pull him into the light. Miss Marple sat alone in the dim light of her sitting room, the fire now reduced to embers and the clock ticking softly on the mantel. The pieces of the puzzle lay scattered still, though their edges had begun to show the picture. Alan Bryce, the solicitor, was clever and cautious, too clever to leave direct evidence, too cautious to act without distance. And yet his fingerprints were beginning to smudge the clean edges of the narrative. He had motives that spanned decades, and a subtle hand capable of nudging others into action, while he stood comfortably in the background. Miss Marple knew that to expose a man like Bryce, one had to pull away not the mask, but the mask behind the mask. The next morning she requested Inspector Drew join her in the Manor's drawing room for tea, and after a short exchange she explained her plan. "I need you to invite Mr. Bryce here for a final estate consultation, just as a formality," she said calmly, pouring tea with steady hands. "We'll say it concerns a clause in the will, something minor and bureaucratic, something that will bring him into the room with Clara, Dr. Penrose, and Lewis." Drew gave her a skeptical look. "What's the point of gathering them all? To watch him, and to let him believe he's won. People like Mr. Bryce only ever reveal themselves when they think the game is over." By mid-afternoon, all four individuals were seated in the drawing room. Clara sat near the hearth, pale but composed, her eyes flicking anxiously toward the others. Dr. Penrose appeared resigned, cautiously polite, clearly eager to avoid further embarrassment. Lewis sat awkwardly at the edge of a high-backed chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Bryce entered last, briefcase in hand, face smooth and unreadable. He greeted each person with professional detachment, then took his seat across from Miss Marple and Drew. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began gently. "There is in fact no new clause to review. What I needed was your attention for a simple matter of clarification. You see, the Colonel's will has a curious sentence. Look not at who baked the cake, but at who chose to serve it. I believe now that sentence was meant as misdirection. A riddle. The cake, you see, was never the weapon, but the performance around it. That is where the truth lies." She turned toward Lewis. "You told us Clara handled the knife, but you also said she removed a sugar flower." Lewis nodded uncertainly. "Yes, she said it looked crooked." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That flower was edible sugar, was it not?" "Yes." "Yet no one else recalls seeing it removed." Bryce raised an eyebrow. "I fail to see how that's relevant." "Because," Miss Marple said smoothly, "there never was a sugar flower on the cake. I visited the bakery yesterday. I asked them to replicate the Colonel's order exactly. They told me the design was simple. A chocolate sponge, raspberry filling, and a plain cream top. No flowers, no decorations at all." Silence settled into the room like dust. Clara's brow furrowed. Lewis looked stricken. Dr. Penrose turned his head sharply. Bryce, however, remained still. "If there was no flower," Miss Marple continued, "then Lewis's memory was altered, and not by accident. Someone planted the idea in his mind. Someone who knew he would be questioned and wanted his testimony, to gently nudge suspicion toward Clara. Not an overt accusation, just a subtle redirection." Drew interjected. "Are you suggesting Bryce spoke to Lewis before the police interviewed him?" "Of course he did," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm. As the executor of the will and the family's legal counsel, Bryce had every reason and excuse to speak with all involved parties. And he used those conversations not to understand the situation, but to shape it. Bryce's smile returned, thin and amused. That's an interesting theory, Miss Marple. But I do wonder, if I had wanted to deflect suspicion, why not simply destroy the will or alter it? You didn't need to, she said. You had something better, a second will. This time, even Bryce blinked. That's nonsense, Miss Marple continued. You drafted it weeks ago. The Colonel signed it privately. It named Lewis as a beneficiary, not of the house or fortune, but of a trust, a quiet arrangement. It would have embarrassed Clara, perhaps raised questions. But it was legal. And you never filed it. Drew looked up sharply. Do you have proof? No. But I believe it's still in Bryce's possession. Not filed, not destroyed. It was your leverage, wasn't it? She turned toward Bryce, her expression unchanged. You couldn't control the Colonel anymore, but you could control the outcome. Until he threatened to go public. Until he arranged that meeting with Eldridge. Bryce's lips parted, then closed again. Clara stood abruptly. Is this true? She demanded. Did you keep the will? Did you let us all think? He turned toward her, voice still calm. I was trying to protect the estate, your reputation. Your uncle was about to undo everything. Give it all to a stranger. Lewis flinched, his voice barely audible. I didn't ask for any of it. Bryce rose. You didn't have to. You were the perfect pawn, a name, a face, a quiet threat to the old order. Your arrival was enough to send Denham spiraling. He was unstable. He didn't deserve. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That's why you poisoned him. Not out of greed, but to preserve your illusion of control. You thought you could guide the chaos, contain it. And when Clara began to panic, you encouraged her silence. When Penrose began to suspect, you planted the poison. When Lewis became inconvenient, you sent him that letter. Bryce's calm cracked, not into outrage, but into something more dangerous, indifference. He looked around the room, then exhaled slowly. You have no evidence? No, Miss Marple said softly. But I have something better. She walked to the writing desk and pulled out a simple object, the napkin ring. She held it up. The only one not returned to the drawer. And inside, she unscrewed the tiny cap on the side, a residue of powder, enough to suggest it carried something dangerous. Once, you thought no one would look there. A keepsake, decorative. Drew stepped forward and took the ring. We'll test it. Bryce said nothing. He reached for his briefcase, but Drew's hand closed over his wrist before he could open it. I think we'll have a look at that as well, the inspector said, evenly. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, quietly watching as the illusion began to crumble. Not with a confession or a chase, but with silence, tightening like a noose around a man who had built his life on staying just out of reach. The poison had been hidden in plain sight, just like the killer. And now, finally, both had been seen. The air inside Denham Manor felt oddly still after Bryce's quiet detainment. Inspector Drew had taken him away in near silence, the solicitor offering no protest, only a single glance at Miss Marple, as if registering for the first time that he had underestimated her completely. With the others dismissed and the drawing, room empty once more, Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, mind alert despite the long hours. She had no satisfaction in Bryce's downfall, only a gnawing certainty that something wasn't finished. The case had revealed its face but not yet its bones. Late that night, she returned to her cottage and placed the napkin ring inside a cloth-lined box, which she locked in her writing desk until the authorities could arrange proper forensic testing. It was a relic of deception, a small, unassuming object that had nearly gone unnoticed, just as its owner had intended. She made careful notes in her journal, cross-referencing statements and times, drawing connections between the inheritance, the second will, and Bryce's deliberate manipulations. But something continued to press at her. One thread still pulled taut, the second will itself. The following morning, Inspector Drew arrived earlier than expected, rain slicking the shoulders of his coat. His face was tight, his voice curt. "We have a problem," he said, stepping inside. Bryce's briefcase was empty. Miss Marple looked up calmly. Of course it was. He had 20 minutes in the interview room before I returned. The moment we walked out, he was alone. The clerk thought he needed water. He destroyed it then. If there ever was a second will, we have no copy. No mention in his office, not even a carbon draft. Miss Marple gestured to the desk. The napkin ring is still here. I haven't moved it. But when she unlocked the drawer, the box was there, untouched, but light, too light. She opened the lid. The ring was gone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Drew leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Who else has been in this room?" "No one," Miss Marple said. "But the lock shows no sign of tampering. It wasn't broken into. A key? No copy exists." She stared at the box, lips pressed tight. It wasn't the napkin ring alone that mattered. It was the residue inside it, the trace that could tie Bryce conclusively to the means of murder. Without it, her theory returned to mere suggestion. Drew ran a hand through his hair. Someone is protecting him, or at least working to bury what's left. Miss Marple's mind turned to the only people who'd had access to her study in recent days. The vicar's wife had dropped off a cake tin. Clara had visited once, briefly, bringing a scarf she claimed Miss Marple had left behind. And Lewis, nervous, jumpy Lewis, had been outside her gate, though he hadn't come in. She thought again of the letter he'd received. It had been meant to push him away, yes, but also to make him disappear, to silence him before he could realize how valuable he'd become. "I need to speak with Lewis," she said softly. "Before someone else does." They found him at the bakery stacking trays near the front window. His eyes widened when he saw them, and Miss Marple detected something different in his expression, not fear but confusion, like someone who had been told one version of events but was now starting to question it. "I didn't take anything," he said before they even asked. "I didn't go near your house." Miss Marple stepped forward. "I believe you, but someone used you. And now that person is growing desperate." Lewis hesitated. I got another letter this morning." He fished it from his coat pocket, hands shaking slightly. "This one was shorter than the first. Leave quietly. No more stories. No one will believe you if you stay." It was typed. Miss Marple read it twice. "They're running out of ways to control you." Drew took the note. "We'll trace the paper and ink. Anything helps." Miss Marple turned back to Lewis. "You saw something, didn't you, not during the luncheon, but the day before? At the manor, something that didn't make sense." He nodded slowly. "I came early. Dropped off the cake before the guests arrived. Mr. Bryce was already there. Said he was finalizing the will. But I saw him go into the study and lock the door. When he came out, he was red-faced, and he had an envelope. He was sweating, shaky." "You didn't mention this before," Drew said. "I thought it was private stuff. I didn't think it mattered." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And did he leave through the front?" "No. He went around the back. That was the missing moment." Bryce had been seen coming from the study before the murder, carrying an envelope, possibly the new will. But now both the document and the napkin ring were gone. And someone had slipped into Miss Marple's study without leaving a trace. That evening, as the village settled under grey skies and the last of the shops shuttered their doors, Miss Marple sat again in her armchair, thinking through the events with a needle-pointed calm. Someone else had entered her home. Someone familiar enough to walk the garden path. Familiar enough to be let in if spotted. A lock had not been forced, no tools, no scratches, which meant either the person had a key or had no need for one. She stood abruptly and went to her bookshelf. Behind a row of old novels tucked beside her account book was a small velvet pouch she kept for jewelry repairs. It had been opened. Inside were her duplicate drawer keys, used only when she misplaced. The primary one was missing. She walked slowly to her front door and looked out into the night. The gate creaked in the wind, and the hedges rustled faintly. Whoever had taken the ring had done so not with force, but with familiarity, with comfort. And that meant one thing. It wasn't Bryce who had stolen the evidence after all. It was someone who had been watching both her and him. Someone still inside the game. The wind howled outside Miss Marple's cottage as midnight crept past, bending branches against the window panes, and carrying with it the unmistakable tension of a story that refused to end. She had just finished resetting the lock on her writing desk, pointlessly perhaps, given that someone had already found their way in without disturbing a thing, when a sharp knock shattered the quiet. Not loud, but urgent. She opened the door, to find Inspector Drew, rain dripping from his coat, his face grim and pale. "She's gone," he said without preamble. Miss Marple blinked. "Who?" "Clara. Left the manor sometime before supper. Took nothing. No one saw her leave. She didn't tell the staff. There was a note on her dressing table. 3 words. I'm sorry. Goodbye." The words settled heavily between them. "She's not the type to vanish," Miss Marple said. "Not without a plan. And not without a reason." Drew shook his head. "I had a constable watching the property. No one reported anything unusual, but the note was folded around a photograph, an old one, a woman holding a baby. It was signed M." Miss Marple felt her breath catch. "Margaret. Maybe. Or maybe it's something else entirely." They rode in silence to the manor, where the staff was still awake, whispering through hallways and casting nervous glances at closed doors. Clara's room was untouched apart from the note, and the photograph lay on the nightstand where Drew had left it. Miss Marple picked it up. The image was faded and sun-worn, but the woman's face was clear. Strong features, dark hair pulled back, standing in a modest kitchen with a baby in her arms. Behind them, just barely visible, was a calendar marked 1911. Miss Marple studied the expression. The woman wasn't smiling, not fully. There was something fierce in her posture, protective. She turned to Drew. "This isn't Clara's mother." "Then who?" "I don't know. But this photo didn't come from nowhere. Someone wanted her to find it. Someone wanted her to run." They went over every step Clara had taken that day, her movements in the house, her conversation with the housekeeper, her solitary walk through the garden just before the rain began. No one remembered seeing her return. Her car was still in the drive, keys left inside. She couldn't have gone far, but there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the soft earth by the gate, and no witnesses on the road. The next morning, as grey light spilled reluctantly over Chipping Barton, Miss Marple walked to the church. Not to pray, though some might say she did, but to search. The graveyard behind the nave had old markers, many nearly worn smooth, but her interest wasn't in the headstones. It was in the small crypt beneath the vestry, one rarely opened except for repairs or storage. She asked the groundskeeper for the key, citing an old historical inquiry. He obliged without question. Inside the crypt, among dusty chairs and mildewed ledgers, she found what she was looking for, a narrow iron door at the far end, leading to a passage long disused. It connected, according to parish records, to a tunnel that once ran under the hill, a relic from wartime, used by locals to avoid open roads. It had collapsed in places, but the entrance still remained. If someone wanted Clara to disappear, unseen, this would be the perfect route. and it was on church land, accessible to very few. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and waited. By midday, news arrived from the station. Alan Bryce had attempted escape. During transfer to the county court, he had feigned illness and slipped from the medical van during a roadside delay. He had a head start of an hour before anyone noticed. A manhunt was underway, but the roads were slick and visibility low. He could be anywhere. Miss Marple asked to see the clerk who had escorted him. The man, young and rattled, admitted that Bryce had been calm, almost too calm, and had requested a moment alone in the back to gather himself. That was when he vanished. No scuffle, no alarm. Just a missing man and a cooling trail. But Miss Marple didn't believe Bryce was running. Not exactly. She believed he was circling. That evening she returned to the manor one final time. The staff had withdrawn. A constable now stood near the garden gate. Inside, silence settled like dust. She asked to go alone to the study. Drew hesitated, then agreed. She closed the door behind her and stood at the colonel's desk. Everything remained as it had been since the day of the murder. The same stack of papers, the same faded blotter, the empty chair that still held its shape. She reached for the drawer Bryce had once opened. The drawer Clara claimed held the envelope she burned and paused. Then, slowly, she pulled it open. Inside was nothing, or so it appeared, but she ran her fingers along the underside of the drawer and felt it. A false base. Carefully she lifted it. There it was. A second envelope. Unmarked. She opened it. Inside, a single page. If anything happens to me, look to the man who knows every secret but tells none. He is not my lawyer, he is my executioner. The handwriting was unmistakable. The colonel had known. He hadn't trusted Bryce for some time. The will, if it had ever existed, might not have been the only safeguard. He had left behind this final message, hidden in the place no one thought to check again. Not even Miss Marple. Until now. She turned at the sound of the door creaking. Clara stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, eyes wide. "I couldn't leave," she said quietly. "I tried, but something kept pulling me back." Miss Marple stepped forward and took her hand. "Someone made you believe you had something to run from. But it's time you saw who really had something to hide." And from the hallway beyond, a shadow shifted. Light footsteps retreating too quickly. Miss Marple moved to the door and stepped into the corridor just in time to see the figure dart through the back entrance. Not Bryce. Too slight, too quick. She recognized the coat instantly. Mrs. Tilling, the housekeeper. Miss Marple's breath caught. The gatekeeper to everything. The one person no one ever suspected. And she was already disappearing into the dark. Miss Marple's heart raced as she stepped swiftly into the corridor, her mind already piecing together the new fragment of the puzzle. Mrs. Tilling had been part of the household for years, trusted, unobtrusive. And yet, the woman who had served the colonel with unflagging loyalty had somehow become the center of it all. Miss Marple's instinct told her she'd missed something vital. She'd been focused on the larger players, Bryce, Clara, Penrose. But the quiet, seemingly invisible figure had escaped her notice. By the time she reached the back entrance, Mrs. Tilling was nowhere to be seen. The rain had started to fall heavier now, streaking the windows in jagged lines. Miss Marple stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Drew had gone off to investigate another lead, and the constable stood watch by the gates. They were all missing something she'd overlooked. It wasn't until Miss Marple turned back toward the study that she spotted it. A single item left behind on the small side table in the hallway. A book, half open. She reached for it instinctively and noticed the cover. It was an old volume of poetry, Thomas Hardy, one of the colonel's favorite authors. She flipped it open and immediately saw the scribbled note inside. It wasn't the Colonel's handwriting, but Mrs. Tilling's. "The game is almost over. You know what to do." Next, the word sent a chill down her spine. Mrs. Tilling hadn't just been a servant. She had been complicit. She had known all along. The game. What game? Miss Marple flipped through the pages, her mind racing. She glanced back at the note and looked for a specific detail, a word or a clue that could connect everything. There. It was, in the margin of the last page, a small, almost imperceptible ink smudge, as though something had been hurriedly written over and then erased. She ran her fingers over the page, feeling the slight ridges where the ink had once been. She could make out part of a name. Not Mrs. Tilling, but someone else entirely. She leaned closer. Margaret Denham. October 1920. Miss Marple froze. The name was unmistakable. Margaret Denham, the mother of the boy Lewis, the very same woman who had been mentioned in the mysterious letters. The Colonel had written to her. And now it seemed Mrs. Tilling had been hiding the truth from everyone. She closed the book with a quiet snap and immediately left the study, retracing her steps toward the garden. Mrs. Tilling must have known the Colonel's darkest secrets. About his, past, about Margaret, about the lost child. She had orchestrated every step of this scheme, using the fragile connections between Clara, Bryce, and even Lewis to cover her own tracks. It wasn't until Miss Marple stood near the old, overgrown hedge by the back of the house that the full weight of the realization hit her. Mrs. Tilling had been the true keeper of the Colonel's history, the one who knew what was at stake. Her control over the household, her subtle influence on the others. It all made sense now. Miss Marple walked toward the garden shed, her eyes scanning the overgrown plants and forgotten tools strewn about the yard. There was something off about the way the earth around the shed had been disturbed. She knelt down, her hand brushing over the soil, and found it. Half buried beneath the damp earth, a small metal box. She dug it out, carefully lifting it in her hands. The lid was heavy and tarnished, but it opened with ease. Inside, wrapped in old yellowed parchment, was a stack of documents. Miss Marple unfolded the top page, and her eyes widened. It was the second will. The one Bryce had been so desperate to hide, the one he had hoped to burn, to erase from the Colonel's memory. But Mrs. Tilling had kept it hidden, and she had never truly believed that the Colonel would turn back the clock and bring his past into the light. The will confirmed everything. Lewis as the true heir. The only question that remained was why Mrs. Tilling had gone to such lengths to ensure that no one knew about it. The answer was buried somewhere in the past, and it had everything to do with Margaret Denham. The hidden relationship, the birth of Lewis, and the secret kept for years. Miss Marple sat back on her heels, the dampness of the ground seeping through her skirt. All the pieces were finally fitting together. But there was one last thing. She returned to the house, the will clutched tightly in her hands, and found Drew sitting in the study, waiting for her. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice tight with impatience. "Everything," Miss Marple said quietly. She set the will down on the desk between them. "This is it? The truth?" Drew's eyes scanned the document, the lines on his face softening as he read. "So it's true. Lewis is the heir. But why would Mrs. Tilling hide this from everyone?" Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Because she knew that the Colonel's past couldn't stay buried. She knew the truth about Margaret and the child, her child. And if anyone found out, it would ruin everything. Drew shook his head. But why did she kill him? Why the poison? Because the Colonel was about to reveal it all. He was going to force her to face the truth, to admit the crime she had been hiding for years. And when he met with Eldridge, it was to blackmail her. Drew finished. Exactly. Mrs. Tilling had everything to lose. The power, the control over Clara, even the legacy of the Colonel's estate. So she killed him before anyone could expose her. The pieces were finally in place, and as the light from the setting sun filtered through the window, Miss Marple knew that the end was near. They would find Mrs. Tilling. They would bring her to justice, and the secret would finally be uncovered, Miss I. Marple stood at the window, her eyes fixed on the sprawling gardens that surrounded Denham Manor. The air was thick with tension, the rain that had been pouring steadily now abating into a soft drizzle. She could feel the truth finally pressing at the edge of her mind, the last thread pulling her forward. Drew had taken the will to the constables, and the arrest of Mrs. Tilling was imminent. But as much as the pieces were falling into place, something lingered in the back of her thoughts. A deeper, darker question that needed to be answered. She turned from the window and faced Drew, who had been poring over the papers she had left out. His face was tense, his lips pressed together in frustration. "You're thinking what I'm thinking, aren't you?" she asked quietly. Drew didn't look up. "I thought we had this solved. We have the will, the motive. Mrs. Tilling stands to lose everything, and she killed the Colonel to protect her past. It makes sense. It makes sense on the surface," Miss Marple said, moving closer. "But there's something else, something that doesn't add up." Drew looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Tilling wasn't acting out of greed or power alone. She wasn't just protecting her inheritance, or even the secret about Margaret and Lewis. There's something deeper here. A fear, perhaps, a kind of desperation. "Desperation," Drew repeated, his tone skeptical. "She had everything under control. She manipulated the Colonel's trust. She held all the cards." "She did," Miss Marple said softly. "But there's one thing. She didn't control her own guilt." Drew frowned, not entirely following. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple walked over to the desk and picked up the photograph that Clara had found in her room. The one with the woman holding a baby, marked with the name Margaret Denham, October 1920. She turned it over slowly in her hands, feeling the weight of the story it held. This woman Margaret wasn't just the Colonel's past, she was Mrs. Tilling's too. Drew blinked, caught off guard. "What are you suggesting?" "Think about it," Miss Marple said, her voice growing quieter, more deliberate. Mrs. Tilling was not just a housekeeper, a servant in the household. She had been there since the Colonel's early days, helping him build his life. And I believe she was more than just a servant. She is, a woman, with a deep, unacknowledged attachment to him. A woman who once shared his secrets and his guilt. Drew remained silent as the pieces began to click together. "You think she's been covering something up?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes focused on the photo. What if she was Margaret's sister? Or even her mother? What if, in that year, the Colonel and Mrs. Tilling had been involved, romantically perhaps? We know that Margaret's child, Lewis, was born in 1911. What if Mrs. Tilling's attachment wasn't just to the Colonel's estate, but to the child he had abandoned, the one she had to protect, her child, not his? Drew's face grew pale as the implications hit him. "Are you saying that Mrs. Tilling is Lewis's mother?" "Not exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "But I believe she played a role in his life in ways no one knew. And when the Colonel reached out to Margaret through the letter, when he threatened to expose the truth, Mrs. Tilling couldn't let that happen. Not when it would destroy everything she had built with him." Drew leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. That would mean that the crime wasn't about money or power. It was about something else entirely. Something more personal. "Exactly," Miss Marple said, her voice taking on a weight of understanding. "The real motive wasn't just to protect the estate. It was to keep a secret that would ruin Mrs. Tilling's life. She had helped raise Lewis, yes, but she had also hidden his identity. She couldn't let the Colonel reveal the truth because It would destroy everything she had built, not just with him, but with herself. She'd been carrying this burden for years, and when the Colonel threatened to expose it, she was driven to take the ultimate step. Drew exhaled slowly, his mind processing the enormity of it. But why keep the will hidden? Why kill him when she could have just left? Because she knew that once the Colonel had decided to act, he wouldn't stop. If he was determined to reveal the truth about Lewis, he wouldn't just ruin her, he'd ruin everything. And she couldn't let that happen. The killing wasn't about protecting an inheritance. It was about protecting a lie that had been buried for years, about a woman so consumed by guilt and fear that she would kill to protect it. Drew looked at Miss Marple with a new understanding. And that's why she took the napkin ring. Why she planted the evidence in your study. She wanted to control the narrative, even in the end. Miss Marple nodded. She knew the game was over, but she couldn't let go of the control. Not yet. She thought she could manipulate it just one more time. As they stood in the study, the air thick with the weight of this revelation, Drew turned to her. But if she killed him to protect the secret, why take off like this? Why leave without a word? Because now that the truth is out there, there's nothing left to protect. Mrs. Tilling was not just trying to keep the Colonel's estate or even Lewis's legacy intact. She was trying to protect herself, her identity, her role in this story. Now that it's unraveling, she doesn't know what comes next. She doesn't know how to live with this truth. Drew hesitated before speaking. What will happen now? Miss Marple looked out the window toward the rain-darkened horizon. She will have to face it, just as all those who bury their truths eventually do. The lies she's been telling herself will catch up with her, just as they've caught up with all of us. The real question, Drew, is whether she'll come back to face it, or whether the past will finally swallow her whole. And in that moment, the sense of finality hung heavy in the air. The truth was now clear, but the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Mrs. Tilling had thought she could bury her secret forever. But secrets have a way of emerging, sometimes in the most unexpected ways, and with far more devastating consequences than anyone could have imagined. The night was falling fast, and the air was thick with the weight of impending events. Miss Marple sat quietly in the study, her gaze fixed on the darkened garden outside the window. Drew had left to organize the final steps of the investigation, and now, as the shadows lengthened, she felt the sharp pull of inevitability. Mrs. Tilling had made her move, but she hadn't counted on Miss Marple being one step ahead. The pieces of the puzzle were now scattered clearly in front of her, the truth exposed with surgical precision. But there was one last piece to place: Mrs. Tilling herself. The woman was, for all her attempts at control, desperate now. It was no longer about the money or the estate, but about facing the truth she had buried for so many years. Miss Marple could almost hear her footsteps in the house, pacing in a place of her own making. Every lie, every manipulation had led her to this moment. The final confrontation was unavoidable. Miss Marple had already prepared for the inevitable. Drew would return soon with word of Mrs. Tilling's whereabouts. He had sent a few constables to look for her. But Miss Marple knew she had to confront the woman directly. She had to make her see that the game was over. Mrs. Tilling's control over the situation had crumbled. The lies she had been telling herself, the guilt she had been carrying, all of it was now hanging on the edge of exposure. The clock in the study ticked steadily, each second louder than the last. As the door creaked open, Miss Marple turned slowly, her sharp eyes meeting Drew's. "She's here," he said simply. She returned. Miss Marple rose from her chair, steadying herself as Drew moved to the door to let Mrs. Tilling in. The housekeeper entered with a cold, defiant air about her. Her steps were purposeful, and yet Miss Marple could see the tremor beneath the surface. Her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, betrayed the pressure she was under. The woman was no longer the calm, composed servant Mrs. Marple had once known. She was unraveling, piece by piece. "I thought you were done with me," Mrs. Tilling said, her voice edged with bitterness. Miss Marple watched her with quiet contemplation, unflinching. "I'm afraid we are far from done, Mrs. Tilling. I know everything now. Everything you've tried so hard to keep hidden." Mrs. Tilling's face flickered with an emotion that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Fear, regret, perhaps even shame. But it passed quickly, replaced by her usual veneer of control. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her words lacked conviction. "Don't you?" Miss Marple said, her voice calm, almost soothing. "You took everything from the Colonel, the truth, the legacy, and the family he tried to repair. You thought you could bury it all, but you underestimated what he was willing to reveal." Mrs. Tilling stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "You think I killed him for that? For some petty family squabble? You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. "You didn't kill him out of greed. You killed him out of fear. Fear of the truth. The truth about your past, about Margaret and the child you raised as your own." Mrs. Tilling's breath caught. For a moment she seemed to retreat inside herself, as if bracing against the weight of the accusation. She swallowed hard, her face pale. "You're wrong," she whispered. "I did what I had to do." "You thought you could protect your secret forever," Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. "But the truth always finds a way to come to the surface. You killed him because you couldn't bear the thought of losing everything. The man you loved, the child you raised, the life you built. You feared the world would finally see who you truly were." Mrs. Tilling's composure cracked for just a moment, her hands trembling visibly. She looked at Miss Marple, her eyes wild with a mix of rage and fear. "I didn't kill him. I didn't," she snapped, her voice rising. "He was going to destroy everything. You don't understand what it's like living with the guilt every day. I had to keep it all hidden. I had to protect him. And when he tried to ruin everything, I couldn't let him." "You couldn't let him," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Because it would have destroyed you. Your entire life. Your identity. Your connection to him. Everything you've built. You believed that if you could stop him from speaking, you could hold on to the past." Mrs. Tilling's shoulders sagged, the weight of her confession settling on her. She shook her head, tears threatening to spill, but she stood her ground. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said quietly. "But when I saw the way he was looking at me, like he knew, I couldn't let him destroy me. I couldn't let him expose everything." Miss Marple nodded slowly, understanding. "So you took matters into your own hands. You saw the opportunity when the guests left. You poisoned the Colonel's brandy, knowing it would look like an accident. But you didn't count on one thing. You didn't count on me." Mrs. Tilling's face twisted with frustration, the last of her defenses crumbling. "You have no idea what it was like," she said bitterly. "I gave up everything to protect that secret. And now you're telling me it was all for nothing." "It was for nothing," Miss Marple said softly, "because the truth always comes out, and in the end it was never about the money or the power. It was about your guilt. The weight of it was too much to bear, wasn't it?" Mrs. Tilling's shoulders slumped, and she let out a long, shaky breath. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to protect him. And now it's all gone. All of it." Miss Marple took a step back, allowing the woman to face her own unraveling. She had exposed herself, more than just the murderer, but the woman who had lived in the shadow of her own lies for far too long. Mrs. Tilling's actions, her desperate attempt to control the narrative, had finally caught up with her. "It's over, Mrs. Tilling," Miss Marple said quietly. "The truth is won. For a long moment Mrs. Tilling stood there, her head bowed, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her shoulders. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the door, the soft sound of her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the study. Miss Marple watched her go, knowing the chapter had closed. The final pieces had fallen into place. The case was solved. But the truth was always more complex than the surface. It always had more layers, more people affected by it than anyone realized. The truth had not only uncovered a murder, but the untold history of a woman who had carried a secret for too long. As the rain began to fall again outside, Miss Marple sat back down in her chair, her mind quiet for the first time in days. She had known the truth all along. It had been in plain sight, buried beneath the layers of lies and deceit. And now, with the final confrontation over, she could rest knowing that justice had been done. As the rain continued to drum against the windows of Denham Manor, the investigation seemed to reach its quiet conclusion. Mrs. Tilling had confessed, broken under the weight of her guilt, and the police had begun to gather the final pieces. Drew, though still shaken by the unexpected turn of events, was methodically working through the details, preparing to close the case. Miss Marple, however, felt a strange unease settle in her chest. She sat in her cottage, reflecting on the way everything had fallen into place, yet something told her it wasn't truly over. The phone call came late in the evening. Drew's voice was clipped, his usual calm now tinged with something else, an edge of confusion. "Miss Marple, you need to come to the manor immediately." She didn't ask for details. She simply grabbed her coat and left. When she arrived, the scene in the study was far from what she expected. Drew was pacing back and forth, his face drawn tight. Beside him stood Clara, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with something close to terror. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked quietly, though her mind was already working through the possibilities. "It's gone," Drew said, his voice strained. "The second will, it's vanished, completely." Miss Marple took a slow, deliberate breath. She had anticipated something like this. The will had been hidden for years, first by the Colonel, then by Bryce. And now, in the chaos of Mrs. Tilling's confession, it seemed someone had made sure it would never see the light of day. How? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but sharp. Clara stepped forward, shaking her head in disbelief. I don't understand. It was here. I saw it earlier, after everything." Drew had it in his hands. "He showed it to me, and now it's gone. Completely. The drawer's empty." Drew's gaze flicked nervously to the locked desk drawer, and then back to Miss Marple. "I don't know how. I've been in here all evening, checking the details. The will was right there on top of the papers. I left it on the desk for just a moment. And when I came back..." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple knew exactly what he meant. It had been taken not out of malice but out of fear. Someone had been listening. Someone had been watching. Clara looked frantic. "It's not possible. It can't just be gone." "I agree," Miss Marple said slowly, her eyes narrowing, "which means the case is far from over. Someone is still at work, making sure the truth never fully comes to light." She turned and walked to the desk, carefully inspecting the area. Her eyes scanned the surface for anything out of place, any small clue that might indicate who was responsible for the missing document. The room was as neat as it had been before, but as her fingers brushed across the edges of the desk, she felt it. A slight indentation at the far corner of the desk drawer, just beneath the surface. She leaned in closer, tracing it with her fingertips, then turned to Drew. "Check the drawer again," she instructed. "Look carefully this time. It's not gone. It's hidden." Drew moved quickly, opening the drawer with more care this time. He hesitated as his fingers brushed against the bottom, then froze. "There's a false bottom," he said, pulling it open carefully. There it was, the second will, tucked inside the compartment. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. And it wasn't the first time someone had tried to bury it. Someone wanted to make sure this wouldn't be found, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. But there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. But the more they tried to cover it up, the more they revealed themselves. Drew held the will in his hands, his eyes scanning it with disbelief. So it's true. Lewis really is the heir. He was meant to inherit everything all along. Yes, Miss Marple said, and Mrs. Tilling knew that. She knew that if the truth came out, it would not only ruin her position, but expose the truth about her own involvement in Lewis's life. She tried to stop it, but this will was the Colonel's final word. But if Mrs. Tilling didn't take it, then who did? Clara asked, her voice trembling with confusion. Miss Marple turned to her, her gaze steady. It wasn't Mrs. Tilling, it wasn't Bryce either. The real culprit was someone we haven't been paying attention to. Someone who had everything to lose if the truth about Lewis came out. She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. Drew's face darkened as realization began to dawn. Clara, Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. You took the will. Clara's face went white. She took a step back, her eyes wide with disbelief. No, no. That's not possible. You were the one who feared losing everything. Miss Marple continued, her voice firm. You thought the inheritance, the estate, the connection to your uncle would slip through your fingers. You knew that if this will was ever read, it would all go to Lewis. You took it to protect yourself, to keep your place in the family. You thought you could just bury it, destroy it, make it disappear. But you didn't count on me. Clara's breathing was rapid, her hands trembling. She stared at the will in Drew's hands, her mouth opening and closing, as though she were trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. The guilt was written all over her face. I didn't mean to kill him, Clara whispered, her voice breaking. I just wanted to keep it all. I didn't know how far it would go. Drew took a step closer, his voice low and cold. You didn't think, Clara. That's the problem. The room fell silent. The weight of the moment, heavy between them. Clara sank slowly into a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the tears finally starting to fall. Miss Marple stood still, watching her with a mixture of pity and understanding. The pattern had finally revealed itself. Greed, fear, and desperation had driven Clara to commit the ultimate crime. But it wasn't just for money, it was for control. For the desperate need to keep a life that was slipping away from her. Miss Marple turned to Drew. She'll face the consequences of her actions, but we have the truth now. Lewis will inherit the estate, as his grandfather intended, and the family will finally be free of the lies that have held it together for so long. As the weight of the final revelation settled into place, Miss Marple felt a quiet sense of closure. The pieces of the puzzle had been put together, the hidden truths exposed. It was over. But there was one last thing she couldn't shake. The nagging feeling that even now, someone was still out there watching, waiting for the next move. The shadows of the past never truly disappeared. And she knew, as always, that the truth was never as simple as it appeared. The morning that followed, Clara's confession felt strangely still, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair by the window, the first rays of sunlight creeping through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Drew had returned to the manor, securing the situation with the constables and ensuring that the final pieces of the case were put in place. Clara had been taken away, her fate now in the hands of the law. The second will was now public, and Lewis, the true heir, had been informed of his inheritance. But as Miss Marple sat in her solitude, a deep unease settled over her. The satisfaction of solving the case, of seeing justice served, should have been more complete. But something lingered, something unsettled, something that hadn't quite finished unfolding. Drew had come back to her cottage that afternoon, his face drawn and his posture heavy with the weight of the final hours. He had handled the aftermath, secured Clara's arrest, and begun preparing for the next steps, but his eyes were clouded with something that Miss Marple knew all too well. "Something still doesn't sit right, does it?" she asked, her voice steady, yet soft. Drew sighed heavily, sinking into the armchair across from her. "No, it doesn't. It's done, or so it seems. But I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something. The second will is clear now. Lewis is the rightful heir, but there's still a piece of this puzzle that doesn't quite make sense, Asimai." Marple tilted her head, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the armrest. "You believe justice has been served, don't you?" "I do. In one sense, yes. But something about Clara's final actions, her confession, it doesn't add up. She was caught. She admitted to the crime. But there's something still hiding behind it all. It feels too easy." "Too easy," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes narrowing. "You see, Drew, that is the key. It wasn't easy. Not for Clara. She was the one who thought she had control, who thought she had finally sealed the deal. But she never truly knew she was being watched, never truly understood what was going on beneath her feet." Drew looked at her, perplexed. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple's gaze turned distant, her mind working through the details. Clara's confession. It came too late. She confessed only when there was no other choice. But before that, before Mrs. Tilling's arrest, before the truth came out, did you ever wonder why Clara was so sure of herself? Why she seemed so composed even when the weight of the truth was closing in on her? Drew was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I thought it was guilt catching up with her. She knew it was over." "It wasn't just guilt," Miss Marple said quietly, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for the last hidden truth. "It was confidence. Confidence that she had won. She knew that even if everything came out, she'd still have the one thing no one could take from her. That photograph, the one of the woman with the child. And that note she left behind. 'I'm sorry. Goodbye.' She wasn't just apologizing to the Colonel. She was apologizing to someone else." Drew looked at her, realization dawning. She wasn't just running from the truth. She was running from the consequences of someone else's actions, someone else who had been in control the whole time. Miss Marple nodded, her voice calm. "Mrs. Tilling didn't kill the Colonel to protect herself. She killed him to protect someone else. The real mastermind behind this whole ordeal wasn't Clara, wasn't Bryce, wasn't even the Colonel himself. It was someone who had been lurking in the shadows the whole time, controlling the moves behind the scenes. Someone who never let go of the reins." Drew sat back, his face pale. "You mean Mrs. Tilling wasn't just a woman with a secret? She was a woman with a mission. A woman who knew how to use her position to manipulate others. But there was one thing she didn't count on. The photograph. The photograph of the woman with the child. That photograph was a reminder of everything she had given up and everything she had tried to bury." Drew's eyes widened. "But she confessed. She admitted to the murder." "Yes, but her confession wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. She confessed because she had to. Because she knew that the moment Clara had the will, the truth about Lewis's birth and the history of her connection to the Colonel, everything would collapse. But what if Mrs. Tilling wasn't the one who had orchestrated all of it? What if she was just a pawn in someone else's game?" Drew stared at her. "You mean there's another person involved?" Miss Marple nodded, slowly, her mind racing back to the key moments, the subtle manipulations, the small clues that had gone unnoticed. "There's always another person, Drew. In every case, there's someone hiding just behind the shadows, pulling the strings, from a place no one expects. And in this case, that person is still free. Drew's expression hardened. You think there's someone else? Someone we've missed all along? Yes, Miss Marple said softly, her voice sharp now. Someone who has been controlling the narrative from the very beginning. Someone who has kept themselves hidden, who knew exactly when to step forward and when to stay in the shadows. The one who thought they had everything in their grasp, until now. Drew's eyes darted around the room as if seeing everything anew. The truth was finally beginning to click into place, and it wasn't Clara, Mrs. Tilling, or Bryce. It was someone else entirely, someone who had been lying low, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now that moment was almost upon them. Miss Marple stood up, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the door. We're not done yet, Drew, not by a long shot. As she moved toward the door, Drew followed her, his mind working through the pieces of the puzzle she had just presented. The clock was ticking, and it was only a matter of time before the real mastermind made their move. The tension in the air thickened, and Miss Marple's resolve hardened. She had one final move to make, one last twist in this long and tangled web. The villain had been waiting in the wings, and now it was time for them to be exposed. Finally and irrevocably. The truth, Miss Marple knew, would always find its way to the surface. And the last thing they would all see was the face of the person who had been hiding in the shadows all along. The rain had finally stopped, but the weight of the night still hung thick in the air, pressing down on Denham Manor as if it too knew that something had not yet been fully resolved. Drew had left for the station, his mind still turning over the case, and the staff had gone back to their usual routines, trying to breathe again after the chaos that had turned their lives upside down. Clara, now in custody, was facing the consequences of her actions, and Mrs. Tilling, though unspoken of, had been dealt with. Yet, even as Miss Marple stood in the stillness of the study, her fingers brushing over the desk where so many secrets had been hidden, she felt a strange unease. The case was closed, or so it seemed. The will had been found, justice had been served, and the dark threads of the Colonel's past had been pulled to light. But there was still a question in Miss Marple's mind, one that clung to her like a whisper she couldn't quite shake. She turned, her sharp gaze landing on the empty space by the fireplace. The flickering fire had cast long shadows across the room, but it wasn't the shadows that unsettled her. It was the silence, the deep, pervasive quiet that followed the storm. She'd learned long ago that the quiet after the storm was the moment when a case was truly over, when all was accounted for. But there was something about this silence that felt too deliberate, too heavy. The pieces of the puzzle were in place, but the image it formed was still incomplete. Something small, something overlooked, still nagged at her. Her mind raced back over the investigation, the revelations, the confessions, the hidden truths, and one detail seemingly insignificant began to rise to the surface: the photograph. The one Mrs. Tilling had hidden so carefully, the one that had triggered the chain of events. It had been left on Clara's nightstand, a clue of sorts, but it had also been a warning. Clara had taken it, but why? What was it about that photograph, that moment in time, that had caused such panic? Miss Marple could see it clearly in her mind. The woman in the photo, holding the child, both trapped in a moment frozen in time. The connection between Margaret and Mrs. Tilling had been there all along, but Miss Marple had only begun to see it clearly when the puzzle pieces were almost in place. Margaret had been the key, but it wasn't just about who she was. It was about what she represented, a secret buried deep in the past, a child who had grown into a young man with a claim to the Colonel's estate. Mrs. Tilling had been terrified of that child not because of the inheritance, but because of the truth that would come to light if he were to ever claim it. The truth about her own role in the Colonel's life, about her past, about the choices she had made in secret. Miss Marple knew the key to the entire mystery lay in that secret. But what was it? What had Mrs. Tilling done, or failed to do, that had kept her so tightly bound to the Colonel's past, and why had it made her so desperate? It was more than just protecting a will. It was more than just fear of exposure. There was something deeper, something that ran through everything, the relationships, the betrayals, the lies. A sound, soft and unexpected, broke Miss Marple from her thoughts. The door to the study creaked open and Drew stood there, his face drawn and tired. He had returned earlier than she expected. "Miss Marple, His words faltered as he saw her expression, the look of someone who had just put together the last piece of a complicated puzzle. "What is it?" "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "About the photograph. About Margaret. And about what Mrs. Tilling really feared." Drew raised an eyebrow. "We already know the motive, fear of losing everything. But you're suggesting there's something more." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "Yes, but it's not just about the inheritance. It's about what she had to hide. There was a reason she was so protective of the past, Drew. A reason she couldn't let the truth come out no matter what." Drew stepped further into the room, his gaze now focused on Miss Marple. "What are you getting?" I think I've missed something," she said softly. "I've been so focused on the visible, the confessions, the motives, that I didn't consider what's still hidden. Something from Mrs. Tilling's past that she couldn't risk having uncovered. What could be worse than everything that's already come to light?" Drew asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "She killed the Colonel, tried to bury the truth, and now she's facing the consequences." "But she hasn't faced them all, Drew." "Not yet," Miss Marple said, her voice tinged with a quiet certainty. "There's one more thing she didn't reckon on." Drew frowned, perplexed. "And what's that?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, and her voice dropped to a near whisper. "The child, Lewis. The truth about his birth. The identity of his father." Drew blinked, his confusion deepening. "But we already know he's the Colonel's son." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice sharp now, filled with the clarity of understanding. "But we never knew who his mother really was, Drew. And I think that's the key. Mrs. Tilling knew it, but she never told anyone. She was hiding the truth, not just from the Colonel, but from everyone. She didn't just raise Lewis as her own, she took on the responsibility for him in a way no one could have guessed." Drew took a slow step forward, his mind catching up. "You're suggesting that Lewis wasn't just the Colonel's son. He was Mrs. Tilling's son, too?" "Yes. I think she was his mother. And I think she had to hide that fact because if the truth came out, everything would change." Drew stared at Miss Marple, stunned. "That's why she killed him." Miss Marple nodded. "She wasn't protecting the estate, she was protecting the truth about Lewis. She killed him to keep the past buried, to keep her own secret safe. She couldn't let anyone know that the child she'd hidden all those years was not just a part of the Colonel's legacy, but also her own." A silence fell between them, thick with the realization of what had been hidden and what had been sacrificed for it. Drew let the weight of the revelation sink in, his mind working through the implications. Everything had been about protecting a secret, one that could shatter the lives of so many. But just as the final piece of the mystery seemed to fall into place, Miss Marple's eyes darted to the door. Her sharp instincts told her something was wrong. The air had shifted again, something had changed, and then, just as quickly as it had started, the door creaked open again. The figure in the doorway wasn't Drew. It was Mrs. Tilling. She was back. And she wasn't alone.